Good evening and welcome back to our Wednesday evening study focused on the subject of cloud of witnesses. And we began this study a couple of weeks ago by looking at the incredible disciple of Jesus, Barnabas, about whom we read in the book of Acts. Such a great encourager of other people in so many different ways on so many different occasions and at so many different levels. And since we were in that biblical neighborhood, we continued our study last week focused on Stephen and the dedicated follower of Jesus and servant of others that he was, the powerful proclaimer of the gospel of Jesus Christ, fearlessly, courageously, calmly, and serenely, even to the point of his death, when he prayed that God would not hold the sin of his persecutors and his murderers against them, and also that the Lord Jesus would receive his spirit when he breathed his last upon this earth. So staying in that same biblical neighborhood again, I wanted us to ultimately in our study tonight make it to a focus on a couple of great women of faith about whom we read in the book of Acts, one of them being Dorcas or Tabitha, about whom we read in Acts chapter 9, and then Lydia that we encounter in Acts chapter 16. But so much of this goes back to the very beginnings of Jesus's ministry, when women played an integral part in the band of disciples that followed him. It was a few years ago that I heard an interview on the radio with Arne Duncan, who at the time was the U.S. Secretary of Education. And in the line of succession for the presidency, the U.S. Secretary of Education is 16th in that line of succession, right after the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of Energy. That is buried way down that list. But Duncan in that interview mentioned that in his household, among his family members, they sort of jokingly referred to themselves as the 16th family of the United States, sort of in mocking comparison to how far they were from being the first family of the United States, those who occupied the White House. This idea of first family is one that doesn't trace its origins all the way back to the beginnings of our country and George Washington's first presidency of this nation, but a few presidencies later. Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison, was the first one to ever be referred to as the First Lady of the United States. But that wasn't even during the time that her husband was the president. It was actually years later at her funeral. At the time of Dolly Madison's death in 1849, the president was Zachary Taylor, and he spoke at her funeral. And because of Dolly Madison's gracious spirit, because of the great extender of hospitality that she started a practice that really hadn't been done prior to her husband's presidency. It had been the practice up until that point for the president to meet with his own party at a particular time and to meet with the opposition party at another time. Dolly Madison was such a wonderful person and gracious hostess that she would invite leaders from both parties to their home to share in dinner and conversation. And it was because of her personality, her appeal, her leadership in her own right, that Zachary Taylor referred to Dolly Madison as the First Lady of the United States. And as I think about some of those women who followed Jesus, who were so important in his life and in his ministry, and among the group of disciples that followed him, I like to think of them as the first ladies of the church, the first ladies of faith in Jesus Christ. And we start reading about them very early on. In Acts, not Acts, we're going to get to Acts in just a moment, but Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, we read the following. Soon afterwards, Jesus began going around from one city and village to another, proclaiming and preaching the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, that is, the 12 disciples that he had chosen and named as apostles. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. And then 3 of those women are named: Mary, who was called Magdalene, indicating that she was from the village of Magdala, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing to their support out of their private means. 3 are named, and then Luke says many other women as well. That there were women in the company of Jesus's disciples is something that's really rather amazing, because you talk about something that's countercultural, something that's going against the grain of society, breaking the social conventions of the day. The fact that there are women in the band of Jesus's disciples is truly of that nature, because the rabbis of Jesus's time didn't train women. They didn't teach women. They didn't disciple them. They didn't welcome them or welcome them into their company or keep company with women socially. They often viewed women as inferior and unworthy of their time. You remember how amazed the disciples of Jesus were when they returned back to where they had left him by this well near Sychar in Samaria to find their Lord and Master and teacher talking with a woman. Not just a woman, but a Samaritan woman. And they didn't know what Jesus knew, that this woman had had 5 husbands and was living with a man who was not even her husband at that time. If they had known that, they would have been even more astounded. But just the mere fact that Jesus was conversing in a public place with a woman astounded them. And it wasn't just among the rabbis in the ancient world and in the Jewish community that felt this way, or the community at Qumran, the Essenes, who had similar views toward women. Even notable Greek philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle and Demosthenes didn't place very much value on women. Jesus comes and turns that notion on its head. Jesus comes and reminds us that both man and woman were created equally in the image of God. Luke here in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, mentions that these were women who had been healed, who were following Jesus, but then he distinguishes, as you might expect a doctor would, between physical illnesses and demon possession. A lot of critics of Scripture, a lot of those who don't believe in the supernatural as it is presented in Scripture, would say that, well, there was no real such thing as demon possession. It was just some sort of mental illness. Luke knew that this wasn't some emotional disorder. This wasn't some sort of mental illness. This was demon possession. And so some of these women had these evil spirits cast out of them. Others who were suffering from physical illnesses were healed by Jesus. And their motivation for following him, their motivation for supporting Jesus and the other disciples out of their private wealth and their private means was out of gratitude, out of thankfulness for what Jesus had done. More of them were like the one Samaritan leper who came back to thank Jesus for healing him. The other 9 that we assume were Jewish lepers, they just went joyfully on their way when they realized that their disease had been taken away, when they were on their way to show themselves to the priest. Only 1 of the 10, only 10% came back to thank Jesus. I get the sense that all of these women who had been healed by Jesus, either of physical ailments or freed from demon possession, gratefully followed him. It wasn't that they could ever repay him or that they were trying to pay off the debt. I like what the commentator Joel Green says about this. He says that Jesus's graciousness toward these women is not being repaid by their benefactions. Rather, his graciousness is mirrored in theirs. Just like we are to love as we have been loved, just like we are to forgive as we have been forgiven. Their graciousness toward Jesus was simply reciprocal and in response to the graciousness that he had showed them. I can't imagine what Mary Magdalene's life had been like prior to meeting Jesus, to have been possessed by 7 demons. It had to be a miserable, torturous life in existence, probably one of hopelessness, one from which she felt she could never be set free. And then she met Jesus. And then we're introduced to Joanna, whose husband was an official connected with Herod Antipas, and then Susanna. William Hendrickson writes about Susanna. He says, she's mentioned only here in Luke chapter 8, verse 3, and beyond that, nothing further is known. Her name should not be forgotten, however. You know, if I had just begun the lesson tonight by saying, tonight in our Cloud of Witnesses study, we're going to be talking about Joanna. We're going to be talking about Susanna. Many of us would have been wondering, okay, exactly where do they appear in Scripture? Hendrickson says we don't need to forget these women's names. Of Susanna, he says her name should not be forgotten. Her deeds of kindness toward her Lord in her participation in the support of Jesus in his ministry, her deeds of kindness toward her Lord and his disciples were pure and fragrant and accordingly resemble a beautiful lily, which is the meaning of her name. Susanna is the Greek name. Shoshana is the Hebrew name that comes to us in English as Susanna. But Susanna and Shoshana are the Greek and Hebrew words for the beautiful, fragrant flower, the lily. And Hendrickson says that this woman is living up to the meaning of her name. And it wasn't just Mary and Joanna and Susanna. Luke says there were many others as well. And they just didn't follow him during the early days of his ministry. From reading Gospels, we know that they were there all the way to the end of his public ministry, certainly all the way with him to his death and his burial and his resurrection. As Matthew describes the scene at the cross in Matthew chapter 27, verses 55 and 56, he says, many women, again, he's specific, it's not just one or two, not just a small handful, many women were there looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him. We're going to have pointed out for us in the gospel records that Mary Magdalene was still among them. Joanna was probably there. Susanna was probably there. Among them was Mary Magdalene, the mother of James and Joseph, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. James and John's mom was there. In the parallel passage in Mark chapter 15, verses 40 and 41, it says, there were also some women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, and Salome. When Jesus had been in Galilee, they used to follow him and minister to him. And there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. We start getting this sense, you know, when we talk about the ministry of Jesus and his disciples, because all of the apostles who were named were men, we might mistakenly think that there's always just this large crowd of men around Jesus. It was men and women. And Jesus's love for them is reflected in their loyalty to him. They are present there at the grisly, gruesome, traumatic scene of the cross. It couldn't have been easy for them to witness what was going on, how Jesus was suffering, how he was being mocked and spit upon and disrespected. His own mother is having to witness this, but along with her are many other women as well. So, and this is at a time when the 12, Judas has already done his traitor's act and has gone out when he feels remorse for what he has done. He has gone out and taken his own life. But 10 of the 11 that remained had seemingly disappeared. John, the beloved apostle, seems to be the only one near the cross of Jesus. But it was the women, many women, who stayed nearby. They witnessed where his body was laid in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. They prepared spices for his body as the day was getting late on Friday before sunset, and then they rested on the Sabbath, and early on the first day of the week, they took those spices to the tomb. So they are the first ones, the women are the first ones who hear the announcement from the angels that Jesus has risen. And it is to women that Jesus first appears, and it is women who then take the news of his resurrection to his apostles. William Hendrickson, in his commentary on this passage from Mark, writes that it's a fact that with very few exceptions, the girls and women mentioned and referred to in the New Testament were on the side of Jesus, with few exceptions. Whenever a woman, you think of Herodias as an exception to that, but with few exceptions, the girls and women mentioned or referred to in the New Testament were on the side of the Lord. By and large, it is true that though Peter denied Christ and Judas betrayed him and Herod mocked him and Pilate condemned him, the women honored him and ministered to him and his disciples' needs. So we get into the story of the early church, we get to the book of Acts, and we find this continuity continuing. Even though Jesus is now ascended back to the right hand of the throne of glory, women continue to play a vital role among his followers and in the early church. In fact, even before Pentecost, in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, in the verses that precede that, Luke has reminded us of who the 11 were, the 11 apostles. And then in verse 14 of Acts 1, these all with one mind were continually devoting themselves to prayer. The 11 were, along with the women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. It's great that his brothers, one of whom, James, has had a special appearance of the resurrected Jesus. The resurrected Christ appeared to him, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's great that his brothers now believe. We're not surprised that Mary, his mother, is there also, but these women as well. And as Peter and the others are preaching on Pentecost, and they quote from Joel chapter 2 that the events that were transpiring that day, the sound of a mighty rushing wind, these tongues as of fire that were appearing over the apostles' heads, that this ability to speak in languages that they had never studied, this had all been prophesied by Joel, Peter and the others say. And in Acts 2:17 through 18, in quoting that prophecy, they say, and it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth my spirit upon all mankind, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my bond slaves, both men and women, I will in those days pour forth of my spirit. As we read about the response to the preaching of Jesus on Pentecost, that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you've crucified. Verse 41 of Acts chapter 2 says that those who had received his word were baptized, and that day there were added about 3,000 souls. And the subtext that we need to read into that is, among those 3,000 were many men and many women as well. You get to Acts chapter 6 and you find the prominent place that not only women have in the early church, but how their needs were valued, that first crisis that comes into that growing church. We've mentioned in the last couple of weeks what Acts 4:4 says, that by that point, the number of male disciples had reached 5,000. So maybe we've got a congregation of 10,000, 15,000 followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. They're not yet called Christians. That's going to be several years down the line. But if the percentages held true for them as they did for us several years ago at the Broken Arrow Church, it's possible that there could have been over 600 widows in need of daily food in the church in Jerusalem. And the fact that their needs would be so important, and that the neglect of those needs would be taken so seriously, I think just speaks to how valued those women were in the early church. Even these widows at that later stage of their life, you get to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and you find that widows who were widows indeed, those who had no one else, no family members, no children, grandchildren to care for them, they were cared for by the church, just as it was going on in Acts chapter 6. But there was a subgroup within that group of widows indeed who had to meet certain qualifications and served in what we might refer to as an order of serving widows. There were qualifications that they had to make. The only qualification that a widow had to meet in order to be fed was the fact that she was hungry and she didn't have anyone else to provide for her. But for those to be added to this list, as 1 Timothy chapter 5 describes it, they had to be at least 60 years old. They had to have been faithfully married and have a reputation for good works. They had to have raised children and shown hospitality to strangers and washed the saints' feet, assisted those in distress, and devoted herself to every good work. And what a powerful group of women servants that was in the early church, and what a powerful group of servants that is in the contemporary church. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in the lesson. But just as these qualifications for these women are described, you see the impact of what they're doing. All these good works in which they are involved, the hospitality to strangers that they have shown, the serving that they have done, washing the feet of the saints, assisting people in crisis, ministering to those in distress, and then just devoting themselves to all of these good works. As persecution began in the early church, connected with the death of Stephen, and then now under the leadership of Saul as one of the noted leaders of this persecution against followers of Jesus, Acts chapter 9 verses 1 and 2 read, "Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem." Now, why do I think that's notable here? It's because it was recognized even by the enemies of the cross, even by opponents of faith in Jesus Christ, how critical and how integral the faith of women was. It wasn't just the case that the unbelieving Jews saw male disciples of Jesus as a threat and just sort of dismissed the women out of hand in thinking, well, they couldn't be serious followers. They couldn't be really that devoted. We don't need to worry about them. Saul makes sure that when he gets these letters from the religious leaders in Jerusalem to go and arrest disciples in Damascus, he wants to make sure that he's got the authority to arrest men and women and bring them back bound to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 12, we read about the death of James, the brother of John, put to death by the sword by Herod, and Peter is also being held in prison at that time. Since Herod saw that it pleased the people so much when he had James killed, he was planning on having Peter killed right after Passover. And what we read about in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, was that while Peter was still being held in jail, disciples are gathering together to pray for him. And one of the places they gathered was at the house of a woman named Mary, who is John Mark's mother. She is known among the disciples there. Her home is a gathering place for Christians, early Christians in Jerusalem. When you get to Acts chapter 16, we find Paul and Silas arriving in Lystra. They're going to pick up Timothy there and have him join what is Paul's second missionary journey. And it mentions that Timothy's mother was a Jew. We don't learn her name there, but Luke doesn't tell us her name in Acts chapter 16, but Paul's later going to tell us her name in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, when he reminds Timothy that this faith, deep-seated faith in God that he had, even faith in Jesus Christ, dwelled first in his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. From childhood, 2 Timothy 3:15 says, from childhood he had known the sacred scriptures, which are able to make one wise and lead one to faith in Jesus Christ. Even the Hebrew Bible, the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible were preparing people to accept faith in Jesus Christ. And so Timothy really owed his spiritual formation to Lois and Eunice, this godly, God-fearing, devoted grandmother and mother. In the next chapter of Acts, chapter 17, after they have gone to Macedonia, first to Philippi, and then they go on down to Thessalonica, chapter 17, verse 4, we're told there that a number of the leading women in Thessalonica became believers in response to the preaching of Paul and Silas and Timothy, and even Luke is with them at that point. A little later in that chapter, Acts chapter 17, verse 12, in Berea, it says that therefore many of the Bereans believed, along with a number of prominent Greek women and men. In Acts chapter 18, Paul, having left Timothy and Silas behind with instructions to catch up with them later, Paul arrives in the city of Corinth. He's going to have to go to work with his own hands for a while until Timothy and Silas arrive with support from the Macedonian churches. And we meet Priscilla in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, who is in partnership in ministry with her husband, Aquila. They both work in leatherworking or tent making, depending on what your translation says, there in Corinth. Priscilla is going to, with her husband, co-teach Apollos the way of God more accurately in the city of Ephesus later in that chapter. Romans chapter 16, we learned that Priscilla, along with her husband Aquila, had risked their lives for Paul. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19, we learned that there was a church that met in their home. Acts chapter 21, verse 9, we read about Philip's, the evangelist Philip, who we encountered first among those 7 men that were chosen in Acts chapter 6 to minister to the Hellenistic Jewish widows in the daily distribution of food, after he had served in the city of Samaria and then taught the Ethiopian eunuch. The Spirit catches him up. He finds himself at Azotus on the Mediterranean coast, preaches his way up the coast till he gets to Caesarea, and there he stays, apparently, because he's still there in Acts chapter 21 when Paul comes back through at the end of his 3rd missionary journey. And we learn that Philip had 4 virgin daughters who were prophetesses there in the church in Caesarea. Romans chapter 16, verse 1, we read about Phoebe, who was a servant of the church in Cenchrea. So just as was the case in the ministry of Jesus, so continues this prominence of women and importance of women and integral vital purpose that we find being accomplished by women in the early church. So in regard to the 2 women that I wanted to address specifically tonight in that neighborhood of the book of Acts, you remember 2 weeks ago when we were discussing Barnabas, the second scripture that we went to was Acts chapter 9. We got introduced to Barnabas at the end of Acts chapter 4. He's this generous man who sells a piece of property and brings the proceeds and lays it at the apostles' feet. His given name was Joseph, but the apostles called him Barnabas, that means son of encouragement, because that's just what he did with people. But then the next time we encounter Barnabas is in Acts chapter 9, when Saul comes back from Damascus, having been converted into a disciple of Jesus, the Jesus that he formerly persecuted. and the disciples are hesitant to associate with him. Barnabas goes out on a limb for him, stakes his reputation on Saul, takes him to the apostles, vouches for him, and validates the story of his conversion. But because Saul's life is now under threat from the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, he has to leave, and he goes back to Tarsus. The very next description, the very next scene that we have in Acts chapter 9 involves the ministry of Peter, first at Lydda and then at Joppa. If you'll turn to Acts chapter 9, verse 32, as Peter traveled through the country, he went to visit the Lord's people who lived at Lydda. It's possible that Philip had first preached the gospel there as he was traveling from Azotus to Caesarea at the end of the previous chapter. But Peter goes to Lydda. He finds this man named Aeneas who had been paralyzed for 8 years. Aeneas, this is verse 34 of Acts chapter 9. Aeneas, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. Immediately Aeneas got up. All who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. And then, while Peter is still at Lydda, we start reading about something that happens fairly nearby in Joppa. Verse 36, in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa. So when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, please come at once. Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room. Then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, Tabitha, get up. She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. Joppa was on the Mediterranean coast. It was about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Again, the church there, just like in Lydda, had probably been established by Philip as he preached his way up the coast toward Caesarea. And here, Tabitha is referred to as a disciple, but it's the feminine form. Mathetes is the typical word for disciple. This is Mathetria, the feminine form of that. Her Aramaic name was Tabitha. Her Greek name was Dorcas. But both of those names mean gazelle, the graceful antelope of Africa. So Tabitha means gazelle, Dorcas means gazelle. I may have mentioned in a class or a lesson before that actually knew a woman as a child named Gazelle. She was a friend of my parents during the years of their early marriage. And then they moved away and started having kids, first my sister and then myself. And when we would travel from further north in Tennessee or Kentucky down to South Alabama or to South Georgia to see relatives, we would often stop in Gardendale, Alabama, north of Birmingham, and visit with the Thompsons, J.A. Thompson, his wife Gazelle. They called her Ziggy. And as I was trying to remember her last name today, I was trying to think, what was Gazelle's last name? Was it Thompson? And I thought, no, there's a Thompson's gazelle, a species of gazelle in Africa. So I looked that up, and sure enough, that was correct. Thompson, Thomson''S, no P in that. But then I knew that Gazelle had passed away. I was able actually to find earlier today her obituary. I believe it was back in 2014 that she passed away at the age of 95. But sure enough, her last name was Thompson. So there is a Thompson's Gazelle, and this woman's name was Gazelle Thompson. They called her Ziggy for short. My parents referred to her as Aunt Ziggy, even though she was not a blood relative. But I've just always thought that was a beautiful name, Gazelle, just like the graceful animal. And that was Tabitha's name. That was Dorcas's name. And we're told that she abounded in deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. The NIV expresses that she was always doing good and helping the poor. And that's what makes me think about, the blessing that we have in our own contemporaries, women in the Broken Arrow Church, who can be described in exactly the same way, that they are always doing good and that they are helping other people, particularly the poor. I think about Terry Larson and Laura Copeland and Judy Walker and Mignon Harris and others that are involved in the food pantry and the families that they help on a weekly basis. It takes a lot of work. And the women and men who make the trips down to the food bank, the men and women who work in the food pantry, but by and large, the women who serve in that ministry. Sharon Myers and others who work so devotedly in the clothing room, which has started opening up again to serve needy families in our community. Again, Mignon Harris and Judy Walker and Billy Hale and others who are involved in the women's prison ministry and the service that they provide to those women, many of whom are feeling even more isolated now because of COVID and the restrictions regarding people who are able to come see them, but just the servant hearts that exist in that ministry. We've got online ladies' Bible classes, meaning, I'm so grateful that there are so many options right now for women to be involved in studies together online, and those studies offered at different times during the week and different times during the day. But I know once COVID is in our rear view mirror and we get back to close to where things used to be, I think about that ladies' Bible class group that met on Tuesday mornings here at the building, and the quilts that they made, the scarves that they made, the hats that they made, the Westview Boys Home that they support. I think about Colleen Deathridge and her heart, her passion for Rhodes Elementary School, for New Heights Summer Camp, all of the ladies who are involved in meal trains, and those are organized efforts that provide food for families with particular needs that have arisen. But beyond the organized efforts, there are just women who, by their own initiative and as they see needs around them, just demonstrate themselves as being just like Dorcas, just like Tabitha. They are women with deep faith in Jesus Christ who are always doing good and are always helping others, very often the poor. And it was interesting as I was reading this text again about the death of Dorcas or Tabitha. It mentions that they washed her body and they laid it in this upper room, but they didn't anoint her body. They didn't prepare her body for burial. And they have heard that Peter is nearby in Lydda. They don't send word to Peter to see if he might be available to do Dorcas's funeral. That's not what they have in mind. They want Peter to come because they're not ready to anoint her body for burial. They believe that there is hope yet for her. They had faith that she could be raised from the dead. And so Peter arrives, he goes to the upper room. And remember that Peter, along with James and John, had been in the room with Jairus and Jairus's wife and the lifeless body of Jairus's 12-year-old daughter. And everyone else had been sent out of the room. Exactly what happens here Peter sends everyone out. And Jesus, according to Mark's account of the raising of Jairus's daughter, says that Jesus took her by the hand and said in Aramaic, Talitha, little girl, Talitha cum, get up, little girl, arise. And, you know, this woman's name is Tabitha in Aramaic. Tabitha, that means gazelle. Talitha means little girl. But I think it had to have been in Peter's mind, embedded in his brain, maybe still able to hear it in his ears, Jesus saying Talitha cum. In Aramaic, Peter would have said Tabitha cum. Tabitha, get up. And it says that she opened her eyes. And again, it's hard to imagine a scene like that. Here you have the lifeless body of this woman who has been so faithful in her service to Jesus Christ, and her eyes open. And after she opens her eyes, she looks and she sees Peter. And after she sees Peter, she sits up. Then Peter takes her by the hand and raised her up, calling all the saints, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. Just a wonderful, powerful member of that cloud of witnesses, Tabitha or Dorcas, that we will get to know in eternity. In Acts chapter 16, this is the arrival of Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke in Philippi. They've answered that Macedonian call that they received in Troas. They set sail, landed at Neapolis, and then went inland to Philippi. And apparently there's not a big Jewish population in Philippi. You had to have 10 adult Jewish men to constitute a synagogue. If there had been a synagogue, they would have gone to the synagogue to preach on the Sabbath day. There wasn't. So it says they went down to the river hoping to find a place of prayer. And they do find that place of prayer there. And if there were any other men there, it doesn't say anything about them. It just says that they found a group of women there. Let's pick up at verse 11 of Acts chapter 16. From Troas, Luke is writing this, so he was there too. We put out to sea, sailed straight for Samothrace. The next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony in the leading city of that district of Macedonia. We stayed there for several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening, now remember there were many women there who were listening. One of them was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. She's a Gentile, but she has faith in Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. She is a Gentile. She is a worshiper of God, a God-fearer. She is a businesswoman, a seller of purple fabrics. She has this acute business acumen that has led her from her hometown in Thyatira far away to Philippi. Her hometown of Thyatira was famous for its production of purple dye, and this purple dye was extracted from the shells of mollusks. So according to what I've read about it, it was hard work. It was difficult to extract this dye and extremely difficult to produce. And for that reason, it was very valuable. And this suggests that quite possibly Lydia was quite wealthy because what she sold was rare and of great value. Apparently her house was large enough for Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke and Paul's other companions. And it's beautiful how the Lord, because she was seeking the Lord, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Because she is seeking God, the Lord opens up her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And then not only Lydia, but the members of her household. If she's married, a husband isn't mentioned. And so the members of her household are likely servants, possibly children that she had, who followed her in her faith. Not baptized because she was, baptized because they too came to saving faith in Jesus Christ. So, we find in her a powerful woman of faith and hospitality and fearlessness. I say fearlessness because she receives Paul and Silas back to her home after they have been arrested and flogged and put in prison. She wasn't afraid after they were released to receive them back. So I see her as a courageous woman of faith. And so just as it was then, so it is now, that women are such a vital, indispensable part of Christ's church. When you read what Jesus says in Matthew 25 to those that are on the right, who are put on the right on the last great day of judgment, he says to them, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in, naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. And while both men and women are actively involved in all these acts of love and kindness and mercy and service, so very often it's our wonderful women of faith, our beautiful women of faith who are leading in these acts of service. So sisters, we thank you. We honor you. We appreciate you. We love you. And we seek to follow your example of love and compassion and service to Christ and to his people. Thanks for being a part of our study tonight. We will continue our Cloud of Witnesses study next Wednesday at 7. And again, you can tune in right when that premieres at 7 o'clock next Wednesday evening, or just watch it at your convenience sometime later. Again, we hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. We look forward to assembling for worship to our God and Father on Sunday at 10 o'clock, whether you're able to be here in person in the auditorium, or for those of you who are continuing to faithfully join us through the live stream on Sunday mornings. God bless you all and have a wonderful night.